Good evening, everyone. My name is Lee Pfeffer. I am the manager of museum experience here at the Glbt Historical Society, where I'm streaming from this evening. And I am so glad that you are joining us. I want to start by acknowledging that the Glbt Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. This event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. And if you're watching along live with us, we welcome your active participation in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for our speaker tonight. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I wanted to just start the evening by telling you a little bit about the Society and the work that we do. We were founded in 1985 and we are the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender, or GLBT, Historical Society, and we are recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites. We have the GLBT Historical Society Museum, which is where I'm at right now. We're located in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood between Castro and Collingwood on 18th Street, and we've been open here since 2011. And we have the Dr. John P. DiCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District, where we welcome researchers from all over the world to work on various projects and dive through our collections. Please check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources online on our website at glbthistory.org. We've got a lot of really wonderful resources there. We're constantly bringing out new primary source sets and exhibitions, online exhibitions. So it's a really, really wonderful digital space for you to be in. Finally, I'd like to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, I invite you to consider joining today. Members get a variety of pretty neat perks, including a 20% discount on purchases of swag from our online store, as well as the store in the museum. And we actually have an extra holiday bonus for members. Members are getting an extra 5% discount. So if you're looking for holiday gifts to get folks in your life that are interested in LGBTQ history, come become a member and get that extra bonus. And you also get access to special members-only events. We have members-only previews of exhibitions and things like that. You can also come into the museum, visit with yourself and a guest for free. And you can learn more about how to become a member and other ways you can support the society by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. And I want to thank you all again for being here. And now I would really love to introduce our speaker and author for tonight. Tonight's event, we're going to be discussing the history of the struggle for same-sex marriage in the United States. And we're going to be doing that by talking with Sasha Issenberg, who is the author of 3 previous books on topics ranging from the global sushi to medical tourism and the science of political campaigns. He covered the 2008 election as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, the 2012 election for Slate, the 2016 election for Bloomberg Politics and Businessweek, and the 2020 election for the Recount. He's the Washington correspondent for Monocle and has also written for New York Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he served as a contributing editor. He teaches in the political science department at the University of California at Los Angeles, and his newest book is The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. So I would love to bring Sasha on right now. So there we go. Hi, Sasha.
Hi, how are you? Good evening, Leigh, and hi, everyone. It's Nice to be back in San Francisco.
Even virtually.
I've done, a bunch of events since this book came out, and I'm really glad to be doing one with the Historical Society. I think I made 2 separate research trips to San Francisco to use your collections. We could talk a little bit more later about how useful they were to me, but I'm, incredibly grateful to librarians and archivists everywhere who sort of make it possible for people like me to try to construct this history. So anyway, nice to be here with you guys. Let me sort of tell you how I got into this to begin with, and sort of what the germ of my curiosity was. And
absolutely, I'm going to pop off and let you kind of tell folks a little bit about how you got started in this work, and talk a little bit about the book, and then we're going to have a wonderful conversation. And I encourage everyone who's watching, while you are observing, think about different questions you'd like to ask Sasha. Feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lee. So, I spent basically 10 years working on this, and I had the first interest in this in 2011. I had been a political reporter, as Lee mentioned, for newspapers and magazines. I had not written anything about gay marriage or really gay rights in a real way. And I was struck. I remember the night that let's say, so I was working on this book, the Victory Lab that Lee mentioned, which was about the science of political campaigns. And I was having a lot of conversations over the course of that year, 2011, with pollsters or people who studied public opinion in some form or another. And over again, they would make a version of the same point to me, same observation, that they had never seen attitudes on a single issue shift the way that they had on marriage. And at this point, it was like 4 percentage points a year, all in one direction. Really notable, across racial groups, ethnic groups, generational lines. Everybody was moving in the same direction. And I'd covered politics long enough to know how unusual that type of sustained opinion change was. And it was at that period in 2011, I remember the night that this sort of crystallized for me was the night that the New York State Senate voted to pass a marriage equality bill, which was immediately signed into law by Governor Cuomo. New York was the first large state, unlike, say, California, to legalize marriage through the marriage equality through the political process, as opposed to having it initiated by the courts. And it was the first moment that it struck me that I kind of had a sense that this was, I finally had a sense I knew how the story was going to end, and that we were starting to approach consensus as a country. And I was sort of staggered by how little I knew about how we got there. And there are these sort of moments, I think about Massachusetts, the Massachusetts court in 2003 deciding to legalize same-sex marriage, the Defense of Marriage Act passing Congress in 1996, Mayor Newsom deciding, basically in defiance of state law, to start marrying couples on Valentine's Day weekend 2004. And I'd lived through all of these, and it covered politics through most of them. And I had no idea how these events fit together, and more importantly, where this issue had come from and how it had emerged, not only as the sort of dominant political legal conflict involving the LGBT community over my lifetime, but sort of the dominant culture war fight more broadly. And it was already at that point in 2011, we were starting to talk about this as the sort of defining civil rights fight, social movement of I'm 41 now. I guess I was 31 at the time. And I had been shaped, starting in high school and college, reading big books about the civil rights movement, that the movement for racial equality that journalists had begun writing in the mid to late 70s. And I sort of set out with the idea. I was shocked that nobody had sort of tried to piece together the whole story of how marriage emerged as the issue that it was, and how we had gotten where we were at that point, and sort of set out that task for myself. And what happened pretty quickly is that events got sort of the better of me. My initial deadline was February of 2015, and within months after starting work on this, the Supreme Court had decided to hear 2 cases: the challenge to the Defense of Marriage Act and the Prop 8 challenge, Hollingsworth v. Perry, and it became pretty clear to me that things were moving more quickly. And so ultimately, it took me 10 years to put this together, but the goal was to have a single volume political and legal history of the whole arc of this conflict. And one of the things that is clear now, I mean, I think that there's a instinct, I think we all remember the day in June of 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell. And I think there's a, that basically making marriage equality the law of the land. And I think there's a natural impulse when a conflict like this ends at the Supreme Court, because we see a just outcome, to conclude that it was then inevitable that this would happen. And that's often the language we use for these type of landmark decisions or sort of civil rights breakthroughs. And one thing that's clear throughout this story is no part of this was inevitable. It was not inevitable that not just that the Supreme Court would rule on this issue the way it did, or that it would come before the court in 2015, but not inevitable that this would be the issue that really came to define, one could say for better or for worse, the conflict between the LGBT community and anti-gay activists over the course of a generation, or even that this would be a political issue at all. And sort of where my book starts in 1990, one of the things that's remarkable is this is not in any recognizable way a political issue. There's not a gay rights organization in the United States that has endorsed marriage rights. There is not an open court case. There hasn't been an open court case anywhere in the country for about 15 years at that point. There is barely a politician in the country who's been asked his or her opinion on whether same-sex couples should be able to marry. And anti-gay activists, religious conservatives are, active and well-funded and professionalized, trying to prevent gays and lesbians from attaining full citizenship in a wide variety of areas, but they are not trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying because there's no active effort to change those laws. And so one thing that's really remarkable is I think how unplanned, uncoordinated the origins of this were, and how quickly something can go from being a sort of non-issue at the margins of our politics to pushed to the center and being something that, presidents, Congress, governors, and ultimately the Supreme Court have to reckon with. Lee?
Yeah, thank you so much for just giving us a little bit of background on the book. You held it up, and it's a very large, long tome.
You don't have to fat shame my book, but yes.
It makes me think about, you said that it took you, a decade to work on this book, and I can't imagine what the scope of this would have been at the start of that and where it is now. So I was hoping that you could kind of talk a little bit about, what was the process of things rapidly changing as you were trying to write a narrative of rapid change? Yeah. How did that affect the book that that ended up coming out now in 2021, and why now specifically, with it's hard to say a significant amount of time passing since 2015, but I imagine that needs to be a lot of work done to kind of craft and dig into that narrative.
Yeah, so I went back not too long ago and looked at the original book proposal that I wrote in I guess the spring of 2012, and I had a phrase like, as the country approaches consensus on this issue, which at the time I thought was pretty bold, right? 50% of Americans did not support same-sex marriage rights. Barack Obama had just changed his position on the issue. It was, still seen as in certain ways, in certain parts of the country, a sort of cutting edge minority position he had taken. And I thought that was a sort of far reaching claim. And I assumed that this book would come out in, let's say, 2016, into a world where maybe 15 states had legalized same sex marriage. I thought, that we would see it as that the broad fight had sort of been, the one side was effectively triumphant. Maybe the way we look at something like cannabis legalization now, it's not legal in 50 states, but I think everybody sort of acknowledges that the broader political tug of war that exists on that issue, as exists on marriage, has sort of been broken, and like the movement is all going to be in one direction from now. And so I did not think there'd be a national resolution of this. I did not think there'd be a Supreme Court case during the time I was working on this issue. And so that was once I recognized that there would be, and first of all, from a process perspective, my publisher and I saw eye to eye on the ambition for the book. And so there was a sort of decision, we want this to be a comprehensive take on the whole arc of this. And, that is probably best served by, waiting till once it became clear that there was going to be what became the Obergefell case, that there was going to be probably a national resolution. By mutual agreement, it was, take the time not just to see what the court rules, but to make sense of the fallout and what I anticipated, frankly, would be more backlash, and than we have seen, or more direct backlash than we have seen. And so so that sort of then also changes the scope of the book. And I'm, part of it is that one of the things that's sort of both an opportunity and a challenge on this topic is, marriage, unusual among a lot of policy questions. It's something that is largely a state issue. And there are things like the Defense of Marriage Act, obviously, which was a matter of federal legislation, the effort to amend the Constitution in 2004 as a federal marriage amendment, and then the Supreme Court rulings, which bring the federal government into this. But to some extent, there's a way to tell the story of marriage, the fight for marriage equality in this country as 50, or if you count the District of Columbia and the territories and some of the tribal communities, you can get up way over 60 as different stories. And each of them, almost every state has a really compelling political and legal story of how they got to legalizing same-sex marriage. And some of them are stories of political organizing. Some of them are stories of lawyering. Some of them are stories of executive leadership. Some of them are like clearly grassroots up. Some of them are sort of top down. Whatever. And they have great characters, and you can imagine like lots of local color. And one of the decisions I had to make as I went was sort of where in the storytelling this wasn't going to be a book of 50 different, here's how Arkansas got to marriage. But as the court did some of the work for me in, ultimately Obergefell, the named plaintiff, he was a guy from Cincinnati. Ultimately, the court heard 4 cases that were consolidated, all from the same circuit, Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky. And so, one thing that became clear to me once that case went to the Supreme Court is the story of how Ohio came to amend its constitution in 2004, which was ultimately the matter of law that was before the Supreme Court. I needed to explain to the reader how that happened in a way that explaining how Texas amended their constitution in 2005 wasn't really as important. And so to some extent the events helped shape it, but I also, it was the most difficult part of it, frankly, for me as somebody who had, is a journalist by background and temperament, was to sort of turn off the news gatherer part of my brain and metabolism. And I recall, there were a number of days in especially 2013, 14, 15, where, I went to the Supreme Court for the arguments and was in the room hearing them. And, there were some key moments that I did want to observe in person where I could, but there were a lot of days in that period where something momentous was happening in a courthouse or a state capitol. And one impulse would be, let me go watch the New Jersey legislature as they debate this bill, or let me call my sources who, as I, started interviewing people, I got to know a lot of the folks who were doing the political and legal work on this issue. And let me go call them and try to, figure out how their strategy before the appellate court is going to change based on this or that. Or let me see if I can get somebody in the White House on the phone to explain what Obama's going to do. And it was like, I ultimately had to just sort of turn that off. I consumed a whole lot of stuff. I spent a lot of days where there were these momentous, there's a great trial that takes place in Michigan in 2014 in a federal court in Detroit. And I was in an archive in Hawaii, I think the week that was taking place, because there were, one thing that really became clear, and we could talk a little bit about this, about, the sort of materials that were useful at in your collections, was it became apparent to me as I dug into this that after, I'll say roughly 2008, this issue got significant sustained, serious national media attention. But what's up until 2004-08, that period, it still got treated, I think, fundamentally as a kind of culture war sideshow. And in the same way, you go back and look at news coverage in the 90s, and it's like, should Two Live Crew be banned? Or should we teach Ebonics in public schools? And I mean, the sort of crazy, the equivalent of like, should Dr. Seuss be canceled of the day, where it was like a crazy thing that cable news or whatever like popped off about. And like, should a man be able to marry a man was like in that sort of category of, but it wasn't been treated. That's not the way we talk about like, should schools be desegregated? And the media coverage was not, for a very long time, as this became a major national issue, the coverage that you get to an important social movement or civil rights cause. It was the thing that you get to a culture war sideshow. And that just meant that in the 90s, people were not writing intelligently about the legal strategies, the financing on all sides of this issue. And so it became clear to me as news was breaking, that stuff was going to be covered pretty well once it was, in state houses and in courtrooms. And I couldn't add a lot day to day to that was going to help my book in years down the road. But there was a lot that I could add to this story by focusing on events in the 90s and early 2000s that never got told well in the first place. And that's just a matter of like dulling a certain type of kind of curiosity that comes somewhat naturally to me.
Yeah, I definitely want to circle back around to 2008, because I think that is a really, the story of that is really significant to California. But I kind of want to go to the start, is that, the book starts its narrative in Hawaii. And that was a surprise for me too, is, I don't really, as somebody who, has grown and lived in California my entire life, that was a surprise to me to see that, a lot of these kind of struggles, at least from like a legal and political standpoint, kind of started in Hawaii. And I wanted to ask you, if you could tell the folks who are watching and right now, and also, folks who might tune in later, a little bit of, why does the narrative start there? What do you see as, what do you see as the catalyst for this rapid shift of, and suddenly this is an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to mention a bunch of things that are not major kind of historical factors, and are really small scale local factors. So as I mentioned, the sort of state of play in 1990 when this narrative starts in Honolulu is that gay marriage is not an issue, right? Like, none of the kind of political legal infrastructure in this country is contesting this. And I tell the story of a local activist named Bill Woods. Bill Woods was the gay and lesbian activist in Hawaii in the 1970s and 80s. He was incredibly entrepreneurial, like a lot of first generation activists in any community. I think he started the Gay Community Center in Honolulu. He started the Gay Men's Discussion Group. He started the gay newspaper there. He had the first gay themed radio show. He was the first gay man to speak at a party convention and this and that and everything. very good at starting new things, not terribly good at working well with other people or in coalition, but good at getting attention for his initiatives. And he ends up in basically an incredibly petty spat with two women who run or are in charge of the local Pride Planning Committee. And so in Honolulu had a very small Pride parade in 1974 once, and then dialed back to a picnic and vigil that they did every June. And Bill Woods had become very into parades. I'll mention this to pander to the local audience. He had started dating a doctor, I believe, in San Francisco, and would travel for Pride in San Francisco every year. One thing that is claimed by people in his circle, and I could not substantiate either way, was that the famous picture of Harvey Milk wearing a lei in a parade. Bill Woods went around claiming that he gave Harvey that lei to wear. But he became just a parade enthusiast. He was just like into parades. And 1989 rolls around, and he decides that he's going to push this Pride Planning Committee to bring back the parade that they haven't done in 15 years. And the two women who are in charge of this Pride Planning Committee don't like this idea for a few reasons. One, a parade is really logistically difficult and expensive, and you have to get the police department and a whole bunch of things that can be an ordeal. And also, they don't like Bill Woods because they have just launched a glossy magazine that is now competing with his Gay Community News for what you can only imagine is the massive pool of advertisers who are dying to be in LGBT publications in Hawaii in 1989. And so they're rivals, and he comes along and says, I want to do a parade, and they say no. Well, they don't say no. They say you can have a subcommittee to explore. It's basically every bad event planning experience anybody has ever had, like for a birthday in their office. You can have a committee to explore the possibility of putting on a parade. So he calls a bunch of mainland Pride organizations to get details on how you put together a Pride parade. And he comes back and he submits a report to the Pride group, and they still don't want anything to do with it. And so he decides, I'm going to spin off and create my own Pride Parade and Rally Council. And so now he is in the business of trying to schedule a Pride event that's going to compete with the established vigil picnic Pride festivities. He's looking for anything possible just to upstage them now. So he asks the governor to be his chief marshal of the parade, whatever they're called. He gets the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band to perform. He gets a friend who's a chef and caterer to put on an international food festival. And he decides that on the rally stage at the end of the parade, they're going to have a sort of Mooney-style mass wedding. And there have been couples who'd been exchanging so-called Holy Union vows at the Metropolitan Community Church, which had a sort of non-denominational, a gay-friendly congregation, which had a presence in Hawaii dating to the early 80s. There have been couples that have been exchanging these ceremonies without any expectation of legal force behind them, but just these commitment ceremonies. And Bill Woods, who is not a lawyer, came away with the frankly misguided impression that from reading the state family law code, that maybe if these couples exchanged vows on stage under certain conditions, the state would have to recognize them as actually married. And he went to the state affiliate of the ACLU to basically ask, hey, if this becomes a legal issue, will you back me up? And the ACLU didn't want to for a few reasons. One, they have real lawyers who thought that this was a kind of ridiculous read of the law. And they also didn't really want to be part of one of Bill Woods's, like new projects, because he tended not to work terribly well with others. But they also didn't want to say no to him because they were aware that if you get into sort of like public spat with Bill Woods, he'll enjoy it more than you will. And so what happens in like throughout the beginning of 1990, looking ahead to the June to Pride in June, is it's clear the ACLU is just trying to delay him with all of these excuses. We need to check with the office in New York. They say we need to get these law professors to weigh in. The law professors say we need to get these, these cases from other state courts. And it's so clear they're just trying to get past June with the idea that like Bill's attention span will run out after his parade happens or doesn't happen or whatever, and he'll move on to his next thing. And June comes and goes, and Bill Woods is no longer, he was never really that interested in the wedding to begin with, but now he's incredibly agitated that the ACLU has disrespected him. And December 17th, 1990, he decides he's going to force the hand of the ACLU by basically doing a PR stunt. He puts out a press release. He says, I'm going to bring couples into the Hawaii Department of Public Health office. 3 couples join him. They go in, they request marriage licenses, two female couples, 1 male. The health director rather politely says, I don't think I can do this without an opinion from the attorney general. The attorney general comes back and says, no, you're right that under state law, their marriage is only between a man and a woman. But Woods's idea is that he's going to now lead the couples, followed by basically the entirety of the Honolulu press corps, to the ACLU's office to jam them. And the idea is like, okay, fine, the ACLU can blow me off in private, but if there are real couples, demanding help from an organization that has said that it is dedicated to sexual freedom and privacy, freedom and privacy of sexual minorities, and there are a bunch of cameras and notepads watching, they're not going to be able to say no. And guess what? The ACLU still wants no part of this. And they get handed in January of 1991 to a local civil rights attorney who that May sues the state. And what he acknowledges is a long shot lawsuit. And to the shock of everybody involved, in May of 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court anywhere on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage can extend to same-sex couples. And that is basically the world in which we live now. So things that, unless anybody on this call, maybe lived in Hawaii or very closely follows like appellate litigation and in other Western states, the time when things start to become familiar to you is after this period. And the Defense of Marriage Act, which a lot of people, if they're old enough, remember, in 1996, which was passed by Congress and signed into law by Bill Clinton, was the effort of mainland conservatives to anticipate a day coming soon when a Hawaii judge ruled that same-sex couples could begin marrying immediately. And the Defense of Marriage Act was an effort to insulate other governments, the other 49 states and the federal government, from having to recognize those couples. And so, the book starts in Hawaii. And one of the things that's really remarkable is, that sort of what I was talking about earlier is how far from inevitable this story was, and how much this was not, I think we can see bigger historical factors that shaped this conflict. But a lot of this was a matter of individual initiative of, ultimately, Bill Woods sort of gets written out of a lot of this history that got written before, in part because the groups that do Lambda Legal, they keep on changing their name, NCLR, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, but I think it's called something else now. Sorry. The groups that do litigation for LGBT rights, the ACLU, this is a sort of inconvenient story about how change happens. They are deeply invested in the story that we usually tell about civil rights litigation, the story we tell about how Brown v. Board happened or about how Roe v. Wade happened, which is that lawyers deliberately built these, cases to get precedence and chose the time, chose the timing and the venue and tried to get in front of the right judges at the right time and made sure that they had the right plaintiffs with the right facts. And this is like entirely backwards. Nobody had a plan. And so one of the things that sort of happens is that as the national organizations and legal leaders get, deal with the sort of fallout from what's happening in Hawaii, the kind of messiness of the origins gets submerged in the sort of community history of this, because the folks who are out raising money and trying to convince people either to file good cases or not file bad cases, like, they don't want Bill Woods as part of the story. He's an incredibly inconvenient figure for the type of work that they do.
Yeah, it's so interesting that unlike many other fights and struggles that you see, is that this is such a reactionary story. Is so many of at least pieces of opposition are what seem to be kind of just trying to head things off at the pass.
Yeah.
And so I with that, I kind of want to bring it back around to California and kind of talk about 2004 and 2008, which are kind of the really significant areas in which California really got involved in this fight. Is like Newsom's rogue weddings, rogue marriages, and then we get to Prop 8. How did you kind of center the conversation around California in the more kind of in the larger overall arc of the struggle?
Yeah. So one thing that just before we get into California, to get you the point you made, Lee, like the sort of reactionary dynamic here. One of the things that was really important to me to do was to write about both sides or all sides of this conflict. And so, I spend a lot of this book writing about opponents of same-sex marriage, religious, political figures, because at certain key moments, they're the ones who are elevating the conflict, who are choosing the circumstances of the conflict. And so it was sort of, to see the push and pull of how the sides play off each other, it was really important for me to understand the sort of strategy and tactics and motives of folks. I spent a lot of time writing about, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which ends up being very active in the Prop 8 fight. I would think about those two moments in important ways. One, Newsom ends up pulling George W. Bush into the fight for a constitutional amendment. I think that there's a mythology which is developed around 2004. So just to take people back, February is when Newsom starts marrying couples over Valentine's Day weekend. He assumes that it's just going to go for 3 days until the court shuts it down on Monday. Ultimately, I think there are another 10 days before the court steps in and stops it. So you have, some not insignificant number of couples who get married during that window, and then some other local officials around the country, the Multnomah County Commissioners in Oregon, the mayor of New Paltz, New York, a clerk in, I believe, Sandoval County, New Mexico, following Newsom's lead, say we're going to do the same thing in clear defiance of local law. They get shut down in different ways. But there's this kind of eruption of local officials deciding we are going to basically defy the law and begin marrying couples. And then, so that's happening in sort of February, March of 2004. A thing a lot of people remember at the end of that year and is ultimately 13 states end up amending their state constitutions to ban gay marriage. And, it is widely accepted. I believe Dianne Feinstein is quoted within a day or two after the election in November, basically saying gay marriage cost John Kerry the election. But there's some idea that the emergence of this issue helped George W. Bush in a number of ways. And part of that mythology is one that it helped him in the election, right? Is this thing that's treated as indisputable fact is grounded in the political scientists who've spent a bunch of time looking at the exit polls that people use to justify that. And I think it's a lot more ambiguous, to be generous about it, than is widely assumed. But the other part of it is that you often hear that Bush or Karl Rove put these 13 ballot measures on, these constitutional amendments on state ballots to help him. That this was a sort of devious tactic from the White House to use gay marriage bans in the states to, drive up conservative turnout and one thing that's really clear in this history is how much Bush had to be pulled into this fight. And I tell the story of this cluster of very prominent, mostly evangelical activists called the Arlington Group, which includes some very well-known figures, Jerry Falwell, Jim Dobson, major figures in the religious right. And they decide, starting in the spring of 2003, that they basically feel like Bush takes religious conservatives and especially evangelicals for granted, and that they want to extract some commitments going into his reelection in exchange for their support. And they decide that marriage is the thing. They're talking about, partial birth abortion and a ban on cloning sheep, which, if you remember, was for like 6 weeks in the early 2000s, a big news story. And they decide, sort of off of the menu of potential issues, that marriage is the thing that they're going to try to use as their point of conflict with the White House. And so but Bush is slow to do that, to go along with it. And one thing that I came to recognize as somebody who's been a political reporter, that people who write for newspapers, magazines, websites, whatever, about politics, are really bad at writing about internal conflicts within communities or movements. And this is true, like writing on the left, like people write like organized labor wants to do this. And anybody who's like spent 5 minutes talking to labor leaders realizes that they spend more time fighting among themselves than they do fighting in tandem. But it actually reminded me a lot of like watching the left, climate activists or labor unions deal with the Obama White House and be like, wait, you guys are supposed to be our friends, and we spend most of our time begging you to take us seriously. And that's what the dynamic was for almost a year, 2003 and 2004, even as Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage. The Bush White House was resistant to endorse this federal constitutional amendment until that period in February where Newsom starts marrying couples. And Bush's, when he comes out and endorses it, he's talking not as much about the sanctity of marriage, which is sort of his way of talking about, needing to defend traditional marriage, but he uses the term lawlessness. It is about, we need federal order because local officials are acting without, a sense of order about this. And so one thing is it does help. I mean, it contributes to nationalizing that fight in a way that it hadn't been before. It's not to say that Bush wouldn't have found some other way to get there, but it ends up being the sort of predicate for that. The other thing that's important about it is I think it was pretty, in retrospect, Newsom catalyzed a whole lot of change that wouldn't have happened. I think he also probably set a whole lot of people up for individual disappointment if they didn't recognize what I think anybody with a clear understanding of the legal conditions, which a lot of people who were madly in love and decided to run down to City Hall or flew to San Francisco to get married, probably didn't fully internalize, which was like, there was no way in hell that these marriages were going to be treated as legitimate in San Francisco, in California, or anywhere. And but what it did set up was a condition whereby those couples could sue to challenge Proposition 22, which had been the ban that California had passed in 2000. And And the most important part, and the decision that the California Supreme Court delivers 4 years later in 2008 is the, after a whole bunch of appeals and procedural back and forth, is the court ruling that Prop 22 is unconstitutional, and the way to challenge that was to actually have these couples who could go to court. And more importantly, at that point, it wasn't just the couples going to court. It was the city and county of San Francisco standing alongside those couples. And I talked to, a lot of litigators who were involved in that. And they talk about how important it was in that instance and in others. A few years later, when Barack Obama endorses marriage, he sends the Solicitor General of the United States before the Supreme Court. This isn't just about individuals demanding their rights. This is about the federal government, or in some cases, the city county government, saying that we have a stake in this outcome for stability, for community, for, economic activity, a whole bunch of factors. And so those conditions would never have happened if Newsom hadn't done this sort of high risk thing when he did. What's important about Prop 8 is, obviously for couples, so couples were able to marry for 4 months over the course of that summer. There are 18,000 couples, I think, who married in that window. And obviously for folks who, those marriages were allowed to stand, but for anybody who decided they were going to wait to get married lost an opportunity to do so for 5 years. So I don't want to for a second try to minimize that, but I think that the really important thing in the macro story about Prop 8 is how it forces the gay rights movement broadly. And I should just be clear for definitions, because I've used a few of them here. Like, I've been saying gay and lesbian, like there were, regardless of state laws, a lot of bisexual and transgender people who were always able to marry the person they loved, regardless of what laws were in the state. So this really was an issue of concern to gay men and lesbians in a way that it was not universally to bi or trans people. The really important thing was that it forced the gay rights movement, especially gay marriage campaigners, to examine what they had been doing. Up until that point, somewhere between 25 and 30 states, I think, had banned, more, 30-something states had banned same-sex marriage in their constitutions before Prop 8 in 2008. And in almost every one of those instances, the folks who lost, the pro-gay marriage side, had a pretty good set of explanations or excuses for why they had lost. They were in a red state. The other side had more money than they did. They were in a state where they're, unlike California, there's not a well-established gay political infrastructure. It was either, it was an election where it was a presidential election where turnout was going to be high, and that was bad, or it was an election where turnout was going to be low, and that was bad. But there was always this kind of we never were going to win this to begin with. Only one of those states, really, Oregon in 2004, did anybody go into election day with any reasonable sense that it was winnable. Every other one, it was anybody who was honest recognized it as a foregone conclusion that they were going to lose. And California was the exception to that in 2008, because all of the conditions were right. The anti-Prop 8 side, no on 8, had more money than their opponents. They raised $45 million. They had more resources, an astronomical amount of money. I mean, this was one of the most expensive elections in American history at that point. They were in a state where the entire political elite of the state, including the Republican governor, Schwarzenegger, opposed Prop 8. Every significant elected official in the state did. It's a state that has a, experienced, professional, gay political establishment, both at the state level and locally in certain communities. It was on a general election where the state was voting for Barack Obama by 20-something points. There was no excuse that you could point to the day afterwards. And so what that forced was, the finger pointing was severe. Anybody who was in California between November of 2008 and the spring, summer of 2009, it was in any way alert to what was going on in the LGBT community will remember this, because there was a severe, whose fault is this? Who wasted all this money? Who told us we were going to win? Who, by all accounts in the polls, couldn't prepare us for what was happening. And that didn't just affect the kind of community in California, but nationally it forced the people who did gay marriage politics, the big donors, the folks who did actual organizing on the ground, to really say, we have been doing something wrong. We are losing, we are losing races we should not be losing. And we need to rethink every part of this. What's the structure of our campaigns? Are we using existing advocacy groups to do it? Or are we creating new organizations that are just specialized in campaigns? Are we staffing them with people who come out of the, Equality Californias of our state? Or are we going and getting, professional consultants who may or may not be gay or lesbian to run them? And how are we talking about marriage? Are we, is our messaging or our ads, are we featuring, the right people in our ads, our spokespeople? Everything was suddenly up for grabs in terms of rethinking how these campaigns were run. And what you see in the 4 years from the Prop 8 passing in November of 2008 to 2012 is just this radical renovation of the whole sort of apparatus of gay marriage politics. And in November of 2012, there are 4 states that have marriage amendments on the ballot. Maine, Minnesota, Washington, and Maryland. And in each of them, the pro-gay marriage side wins. And it's the first time that they've, basically won a state. And that, without the sort of real panic and depression that came after Prop 8, there would not have been the internal motivation to do what was ultimately very difficult, challenging, costly work to figure out how to run better campaigns.
Yeah, I think with Prop 8, like there was such a, there had to be such a rhetoric change too. Because I mean, I have such, clear, vivid memories of it. And I think the feeling was bamboozlement. Is how did this happen? And I think a lot of that had to do with, so much of the advertising around it being, honestly, the word I can think of is duplicitous. Is how much of the No on 8 campaign had to be focused specifically around letting people know exactly what position was where. The fact that it was a very deliberate choice to, have people vote yes on a referendum that was inherently negative and something that you were voting to enact a ban on. I think that, that certainly contributed to at least, some margin of error in terms of how close that race ended up being. I remember that. I remember that day vividly. As I was in college and.
Hello. Am I still here? And did I lose Lee?
Yes. No, you're here. Are you not able to?
I'm going to assume I'm still here. So, Lee, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. I don't know where I lost you. On the no thing, like one of the it's always difficult to figure out how to run a no campaign on a ballot measure. And what happened, not just in California, but Prop 8 was emblematic of the way these no campaigns had been run all over the country, was the arguments that they came up with were, if you go out and you ask people, are you, which of the following arguments will make you most likely to vote no? The best polling stuff is often the sort of weakest sauce of all. And what came back in the polls were that if you say which of the following arguments is most convincing, I think gay and lesbian couples should be entitled to, equal recognition under the law, that's going to poll really low. And if you think oh, don't change our constitution, that's going to pull really high, and because nobody really disagrees with it, but there's no emotional intensity behind it, and that's how you end up with things like the closing ad of that campaign was Dianne Feinstein in her home library saying Californians let's not write hate into our constitution, let's not deface her. She didn't mention gay marriage, and there was this sense. It became really clear there was, that these campaigns were being waged where the side that was trying to ban gay marriage was talking really intensely about the consequences, mostly for children, of letting gay and lesbian couples marry. And the side that was trying to fight the bans were giving people reasons why you shouldn't amend your state constitution. And the sort of emotional mismatch of that was significant. And what you see when you look at what the ads look like 4 years later in 2012 was they were about why gay and lesbian couples want to marry. And basically, it's for the same reason that straight people want to marry. Not just the sort of legal rights and benefits, but because love and commitment, and they can't imagine their life without somebody else. And that language was entirely missing from the Prop 8 campaign and every other campaign around the country, basically. And so it wasn't just a matter of not showing gay and lesbian couples in the ads and such, which they didn't do, but it just wasn't even talking about the thing that everybody was talking about, which is like, this is about, should gay and lesbian people be able to have families on the same terms as straight people? And the campaigns, the sort of way that campaigns are run, the polling and research and message development, just like was sort of designed to scare people off of the difficult topics and towards the safe topics. But the safe topic wasn't what voters were thinking about when they heard all this stuff about, do you think gays and lesbians should be able to marry? Because the opposition wasn't shying away from that.
Right. Am I back for you, by the way?
Yeah. It was
okay.
a
Great.
moment. And I wasn't sure whether I had left or you had left. So,
we've got a little bit of time left here. I wanted to bring up someone in the comments has brought up a question about the idea of like queer marriage, same-sex marriage equality. They ask, how successful is emulating marriage, as in heterosexual marriage? Does it even compare? I'm curious to know, there's a large segment of the LGBTQ community which has never been interested in marriage and views it as a heterosexual institution. And there's a lot of kind of assimilationist attitudes. I'm curious to hear, what, if any, interaction do you have with folks on this side of the coin who were not interested in marriage equality from that standpoint?
Yeah, so I write a lot about the sort of active debate within the community that really reaches I think its highest pitch, strongest pitch, loudest pitch. I'm not sure what they do with pitches in the 1980s, and there are. At this point, it's a very abstract debate, right? So as I said, there's not a court case that's active. There's not a law that's being proposed. This is something that's, taking place in the pages of gay publications on the, that gay community centers around the country are hosting debates, but like at a very theoretical, like airy level. Should gay and lesbians want the right to marry? And this isn't put aside like as a strategic proposition. Everybody thinks it's kind of crazy when you're still fighting for basic civil rights protections or hate crimes laws to cover you, that you're going to pick this big fight. So like the strategic thing aside, like, is this a desirable outcome for the community? And there are, really three separate factions, I'd say, in this debate. One is the pro-gay marriage side, disproportionately cis straight men who are arguing we will never attain full citizenship as gay men and lesbians without having our relationships and families recognized on the same terms as everyone else's. And so as long as our relationships are held to a lower, different standard than straight people's, we're never going to be equal in American society. And so this is a necessary step for full legal progress. So that's now a familiar argument that we've heard, and it's basically the one that's won within the community. The two sort of factions that are critical of that. One, as you suggest, Lee, very much coming out of the liberationist sort of side of the movement, folks who argued a version of, we have succeeded as a community, especially in the 70s and 80s, by defining relationships on our own terms, by not, by embracing our own sexual mores, by not mimicking mainstream heterosexual relationships. I think I quote somebody here, paraphrasing briefly, like, why would we aspire to the lily white picket fence suburban lives of our parents? And so I think that there's this kind of, yes, anti-assimilationist, liberationist push, and then in parallel to that is a critique of marriage that comes disproportionately from women, almost entirely from women. To the extent that LGBT family law exists in the 1980s, it's female lawyers representing female clients. The clients are women who had been in marriages to men, had a child, come out of the closet, leave their marriage, and then have to go to court to fight for the right to their own biological children. And then the lawyers who are representing them in those custody fights or co-parent adoption or whatever way. But, this is what LGBT family law is. And these lawyers in particular, they're women who went to college and law school in the 60s and 70s, were shaped by sort of second wave feminist thinking about marriage to view it as an institution which existed, had been created and perpetuated solely to subjugate women. And their critique of marriage, I think, came foremost as women more than as lesbians. And it was, why would we as women use our newfound political capital to win entry into this institution which exists to subjugate us? And this was a very lively debate that was taking place in the community throughout the 80s and into the early 90s until that Hawaii decision that came down in May of 1993. And this gets to the sort of reactionary nature of this. One of there are a number of sort of big strategic miscalculations that folks make in this fight, but one of them is that a basic rule of politics is don't do things that unite your opponents. And the LGBT community was divided on this. The gay rights movement was divided on this. Lawyers were arguing about this in meetings. But as soon as anti-gay, conservative politicians, religious leaders decided that the area in which they wanted to pick a fight with gays and lesbians in the 90s was not going to be over HIV/AIDS funding, it wasn't going to be over hate crimes laws, it wasn't going to be over, a long list of possible policy areas, should gays be school teachers, any of these things, it was going to be over marriage. All of a sudden, those internal debates, people still will argue about them over beers, or, it's not like at an intellectual level, these reservations have gone away, but at a level of political decision-making, those internal conflicts basically disappeared almost immediately. And I quote Paula Edelbrick, who was probably the most vocal and articulate sort of feminist critic of marriage within the movement. She had been a lawyer at Lambda Legal and headed Empire State Pride Agenda, which is basically the Equality California of New York. And she'd been at the forefront of these debates arguing we shouldn't aspire to marriage. And then, I quote her saying, around the time of the Defense of Marriage Act, like, the whole world is on fire because of our relationships. Of course I'm going to go fight to defend them. And it's just, I think a basic sort of physics of politics that the movement, people who might have been dissenters on this issue internally knew that they would be, you'd be helping James Dobson win this fight if you didn't, it didn't mean it was a priority for everybody. I mean, this is the other thing to note is, like, I think that there was a kind of understanding that the gay rights movement couldn't afford to lose this fight. That did not mean that it was everybody's priority. Individuals, citizens, activists, community leaders. There are a lot of people who thought that this was misplaced as a matter of priority, of resources. A lot of people who, saw the money that was going into these marriage fights that was not going into other needs, material needs, legal needs, maybe more winnable basic civil rights protections, all this stuff. But the sort of criticism on the level of principle basically stopped.
Yeah. Well, with the little bit of time that we have left, you actually you shared some images with me that you picked out from when you got the opportunity to do some research with our collection. And so I just wanted to kind of close out the evening with that. And then we have one other question from somebody who's watching. So let me bring these up, and I would love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about some of these images that we've got.
Yeah. So I put together three groupings of types of materials that you guys have in the historical society collections that were useful to me and useful broadly in research I did in other facilities. So one thing is newspaper clips. So we are in an era where just in the decade since I started working on this project, the number of things that have been digitized is astounding. And I look back at it's hard for me to complain about making 3 reporting trips to Hawaii over the course of working on this book. But if I were to complain about my reporting trips to Hawaii, they were that I did not spend much time on sand because I was in the basement of the Hawaii State Library looking at microfilm to look at clips from the Star Bulletin in the 1980s. And now that stuff I can look at from my desk wherever I am. And that's true for a lot of big city newspapers, right? So, you don't have to go to microfilm to look at the San Francisco Chronicle, or Examiner going back a few decades. But things like this is News West, which was a relatively short-lived gay and lesbian publication that has not been around as long as the Reporter or Guardian. The clips that are organized by subject category, and you could go up to the next one, Lee. So anyway, so the News West, there are a lot of just small publications, and especially in a community like the LGBT community, where there were a lot of publications that did not live long enough to go from the paper age to the digital age, where nobody has a full run of them even anymore. Subject clipping files, where literally I went and looked for marriage or family or whatever it was. Incredibly valuable, because I wouldn't have even have known to go look for a publication called News West that existed in 1978 that was covering these issues. So, it's not just the fact that those papers are there, but that they are organized and curated by subject is incredibly valuable. Another version of that is this. This is from the San Diego Union Tribune, or the San Diego Union, I guess, before they merged. So this is a paper that probably has been digitized. It's a big city paper, but I would not have necessarily known to search for wife, marriage at this period and assume that I would get a story that was about, this is 1978. This is, in the early days when nobody was thinking about this as a fight over redefining marriage. The fact that somebody clipped this contemporaneously and classified this in a file that you can see in the upper right-hand corner called marriage meant that I didn't have to know what keywords to look for because somebody had organized it by subject. And that's something that archivists do. And these clipping files are just they seem pre-modern in many ways, given that you can search digitally in so many different ways, but you have to know what you're looking for digitally in a certain way that you do not here. So that was just one thing that you guys have a lot of, that a lot of the sort of early history of stuff in California, I would not have known how or where to even begin looking without stumbling upon certain clips. And then I was able to sort of look for things around it. Do you want to go on to the next batch of things? So this is, I mentioned Prop 22, which is the 2000 campaign to ban same-sex marriage, which was successful by a large margin in the state. The entire papers of the No on 22 campaign are in your collection, I believe, the entirety of it. And that means this is a polling. I just picked out a few things randomly, not that there's anything of huge value in the particular pages you're seeing, but they're just sort of emblematic. This is a polling memo. So, a couple months before election day, the pollster sending in, you could start to just see through the cover sheet. If anybody's younger than me, this is called a facsimile. It's a fax. But to have the entire polling and strategy memos of a campaign, I know as a political reporter, even before I was writing about gay marriage, one of the things that's very difficult about writing about political campaigns is they exist for a few months or maybe a year or two. And then literally the day after, the whole business disappears and everything goes into a dumpster. And it is often impossible to reassemble anything that took place at the campaign because nobody really has custody over anything. And so it is remarkable to have the entirety of this campaign. There's available for researchers. There was a huge post-election report that was done after this. I don't know any other state besides California where there have been these exhaustive sort of autopsies of both the losing campaign on Prop 22 and Prop 8. There's incredibly important resources for understanding both the actual nuts and bolts of the campaign. Has a lot of information about their strategic decisions and staffing and stuff like that, but also in a sort of, as we were talking about, Lee, like what were the lessons learned at the time, which are not necessarily the lessons that people are learning 20 years later from these campaigns, but they are a very good way of seeing how knowledge was sort of processed and synthesized by folks in the community in the immediate aftermath of these losses. So you can go on. Here's just a strategy memo from the campaign, new talking points, right? So you can even see, this is in 2000. Here's the messaging. It's government interference. You don't have to support same-sex marriage to be against the Knight Initiative, right? This is one of those sort of messaging things that happen in Prop 8. You don't even have to like gay people to vote for us. Is a great way of building support for recognition of same-sex couples. And then I just had an example of an email. I am a huge fan. I didn't realize how amazing the 90s were until I realized that the years where people printed out their emails and then put them in folders in a filing cabinet is the greatest time in human history. But you get just a lot of the internal correspondence in real time from folks on the campaign and sort of, in this case, I think outside advisors from other national organizations talking about some of the decisions they're making in the campaign. And then the last batch, which may be counterintuitive to a lot of folks who are watching this and maybe are members or support the GLBT Historical Society because you think it's really important to preserve gay history and the history of LGBT community organizations. But as Lee and I talked about in a story where the sort of reactions and counter reactions are driving a lot of this, one of the things that's really valuable is sometimes LGBT historical societies are incredible repositories of homophobic, anti-gay political materials, and the opposite is true, frankly. On the other side, some of the best coverage of gay politics is coming from conservative publications. There's just a kind of know thy enemy dynamic, which from an archival perspective is really important because a lot of this activism was taking place in newsletters or, small scale publications or, mailers that were going out from organizations that don't, especially in the pre-internet era, don't live on in Google. Libraries aren't going out and collecting newsletters from sort of fly-by-night activist organizations. A lot of this never gets picked up by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times because it's a newsletter that's going out to 10,000 churches or something. But because political actors in the LGBT community were really invested in knowing what their opponents are doing, they often went out and collected this stuff. Great stories as I was doing reporting of, folks who would go pay their, gay folks who would pay $50 to focus on the family so that they would get the newsletters and could then share them with other people in the movement. And a lot of this stuff ends up in archives. And it's just really important to understand how, you see here, victory in Hawaii and Alaska. This is, the sort of connection of how these local fights became national fights is a really important part in this history. And without some of these like crazy newsletters, and the next thing is in the same sort of category. Here's a letter. This was from the No on 22 records, but this is went to Mormon stake presidents from the LDS church hierarchy, and this happened in Prop 22, and then in Prop 8. Huge interest in understanding what the churches, especially the Mormon and Catholic churches, were doing in their private communications to members, lay leaders, clergy about this fight. And again, perhaps counterintuitively, great histories of anti-gay politics can be written, only because of gay community organizations like the Historical Society that keep this stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to show this, because I know a lot of folks who don't do archival research sort of wonder what's in there, and I'm immensely grateful to the people that make these types of materials possible.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things about working for the Society is just getting to look in the stacks and just see the sheer amount of different types of materials and ephemera, and just how significant looking at history through the lens of what documents we leave behind, whether they're on one side or another. They're all incredibly valuable and essential to constructing that narrative. I thank you so much, Sasha, for joining us tonight. And I want to implore everyone to check out Sasha's website, put it up here. And we also have some social media. Sasha's got it on his little nameplate, but we've got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram here. And we also implore everyone to go out, purchase a copy of the engagement. If you purchase a copy of the engagement on our bookshop.org affiliate link, which we've listed right here, and you go ahead and send a receipt, and also let us know that you attended tonight's event, we'll be happy to send you a signed book plate. We've arranged that. And I just kind of wanted to, ask you, Sasha, if there's anything else that you would like to let folks know, what's going on with, any new things in the, in your future, or where people can, find more about what you're working on other than social media, anything like that?
Yeah, nothing urgent. I'm starting to work on some new book projects that I promise people will not take me 10 years. So I am very eager for some shorter projects. So I will bite off slightly less momentous subjects.
Well, I mean, hopefully this is something that will, you'll have a lot of things, a lot of things still to come from this specific project. I wanted to kind of leave with one last question of, what lessons are there from this particular fight, from this marriage equality fight, for organizations who are looking to make change in other areas, especially right now, if we're looking at, kind of what is in the zeitgeist, similarly is, fight for trans equality, and this rash of anti-trans bathroom bills that go around the country, which is something that, I feel is very similar to the way that the fight for marriage equality came up in the way that you've described, is that nobody was really talking about any of this until people suddenly decided that it was something they were going to ban and turn into an issue.
And I should say, a lot of the folks who lost. Can you hear me? There we go. Okay. A lot of the folks who lost the marriage fight, even before the Supreme Court decision in 2015, basically shifted the political and legal infrastructure that had been built and funded to fight marriage rights, to fight, the whole sort of bundle of gender identity issues, in part because they saw a similar environment to what they saw in marriage 20 years ago, which is public opinion was still on their side, and the laws were sort of unformed in states in a way that allowed them to be proactive, right? I mean, for them to be the yes side and not the no side, I guess, to go back to what you're saying. One lesson that I think that comes out of this, I write, among the things that happened between the passage of Prop 8 in 2008 and those years that followed, where there was a sort of rethinking of the whole campaign apparatus on these issues, is a recognition that the existing political structure of the movement and the community was not necessarily well suited to fight on this issue. So I write a lot about Evan Wolfson, who was the head of an organization called Freedom to Marry, which was the first basically single issue group doing work on marriage. And they relaunched the organization in 2009 to be the hub of these for all this campaign activity that's taking place in the States. And the basic recognition was, I think there are a lot of people in the community who are very critical of the Human Rights Campaign over the years, that, that they're insufficiently confrontational and they're too concerned with access, and that their priorities don't represent the sort of full breadth of the community. And, I think there's some truth to all those things in different ways. But one thing that's really important is to realize that the Human Rights Campaign has said, and has had for 40 years, a mandate to represent this incredibly broad and diffuse coalition on a whole range of issues, and is designed to go on forever. And so they are thinking about long-term relationship building. They're thinking about, they were going back to the Defense of Marriage Act. There are people saying, why isn't HRC fighting harder to beat this? Well, you know what? When I reconstructed it, it's because HRC's lobbyists finally were getting meetings with moderate Republicans who were open to an employment discrimination ban that covered sexual orientation, who were getting, even more conservative Republicans who are finally willing to support, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS Act. And they made a very sensible strategic decision that if you were getting some progress with people that you wanted on these issues, picking a fight with them on this marriage thing was going to be counterproductive to working with them on the things where you could get gains. And that made a lot of sense from the internal logic of the Human Rights Campaign, which cared about HIV/AIDS funding and also cared about, making sure that federal statistics counted hate at the Department of Justice, counted hate crimes by sexual orientation and not just by race and religion or whatever. But if you care about marriage, you look at that and you go, wow, of course this organization is going to trade away our concerns for these other things because they have this whole big bundle of things that they're balancing. And what Wolfson came along with was the idea that if you want an organization that's going to fight for marriage, that's going to communicate the benefits of marriage, it needs to be focused on marriage and not on trying to juggle all these different competing issues. And that becomes really important, I think, because they're able to run focus campaigns that put pressure on people. Very briefly, and we talk a lot about, there's this moment people remember when Joe Biden went on Meet the Press and said that he supported marriage equality, and it sort of forced Obama's hand in the spring of 2012. And I go into a lot of detail about the sort of planning in the White House behind that and the fallout. But one question that doesn't get asked a lot these days is, why was Joe Biden, the vice president of the United States, being asked on a random Sunday show in May of 2012 what his position on marriage was? And, there wasn't a bill coming to the president's desk. There wasn't an executive order. There wasn't anything that the vice president or president could do on this. What had happened a few months earlier was that Freedom to Marry had decided that they were going to try to change the Democratic Party. They were going to make one of their priorities in 2012, changing the Democratic Party platform to endorse marriage equality for the first time. And the way they did that was they went out and got, starting in February, ahead of the convention 6 months later, they got some former DNC chairs to endorse this. And then they got, I think Antonio Villaraigosa, who was the honorary chairman of the convention, said that he supported it. And then the mayor of LA. And then Nancy Pelosi, who was going to be whatever the person who has the gavel at the convention is called. She gets asked about it. Do you agree with the mayor of the largest city in your state? And she says, yes, I do. Now, all of a sudden, other members of Congress, senators, Democrats are being asked, do you agree with Nancy Pelosi about changing the Democratic Party platform? Cabinet secretaries in Obama's administration get asked, do you agree that the party platform should get changed? And the Human Rights Campaign would have never started a petition drive to put pressure on Nancy Pelosi to make a symbolic commitment for a party platform that has no real actionable value, because they were trying to get Nancy Pelosi to agree to move some really incremental legislation the next year. They were trying to get the Obama White House to enact an executive order prohibiting discrimination by federal contractors. And why would we pick a fight that antagonizes them by putting pressure on them on this one issue when we need all these other things? But Freedom to Marry didn't care about their job wasn't to get progress on an executive order about contractors. And so they initiated this thing, and all of a sudden everybody in Democratic politics is being asked, do you think the party platform should be changed? And it goes up to the level of the vice president being asked, and he sort of inadvertently makes news on it. And it's an example of the type of activism that would not have happened if it just been the Human Rights Campaign, the National, the Task Force, Victory Fund, sort of existing infrastructure, because they would not have made those trade-offs. And so I think in aggregate, the question needs to be for any movement. I think this is true for the LGBT community right now, but people who do climate work or work on guns or immigrant rights or whatever, housing, are the organizations, the institutions that are fighting for our political priorities structured to fight for the actual things that I care about? Housing is a big bundle of issues. Immigration is a big bundle of issues. Gun control is a big bundle of issues. And the organizations have their own incentives and motives and structures that are designed often to serve a big community or a bundle of issues, but they might not be the things that you care about. And so, I think the real question, and this is not something that I've uncovered, people talk about this a lot, and I think we're going to hear more about it, is like, are these organizations that were founded to basically represent the interests of all sexual minorities 40 years ago, especially notably the Human Rights Campaign and the Task Force, but also state organizations like Equality California, are they the best structure to fight for the rights of trans people, for example? And I think that in any community, folks should really interrogate, we're not stuck with the organizations we have. And these are not like handed down from God that you have, and it takes money and it takes discipline and professionalism to reimagine these organizations. It's not easy, but I do think that the starting point for a lot of activists should be to really look at the organizations that are doing the work on your side and saying, are they actually doing the work on the part of the issues that I care about in the way that I care about? And what are the decisions, the trade-offs that they might be making that I wouldn't make if I were building a new organization from scratch?
Thank you. I think that's a really lovely note to close on, and to think about going into the future. Again, Sasha, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I hope that we get to see and do more things together. And for folks who are joining and watching, thank you for hanging out with us this evening. I hope that everyone has a safe weekend and a safe rest of the year. We're going into 2022 already. Can't believe that that's happening. So I hope everybody has a wonderful and safe holiday season. And we will see you again next month for our next event, which will be happening in January. We're going to be talking with Allison Brantley about her new book called Brewing a Boycott, which is about the Coors boycott and the intersections between labor activism and LGBTQ activism, which is something that I've always been really interested in. We're going to be also joined by Miriam Frank, who's the author of Out in the Union, which is another wonderful book that looks at those intersections and that comprehensive history. So I hope people will join us for that. And we'll say goodnight. We'll let folks who are joining in on, the East Coast or other places hop off and have the rest of everybody's evening. And we'll see you soon. Thank you again, Sasha.
Thank you, Lee. Have a good night. Thank you, everyone.